Welcome to 3CT. I'm Lise Soudine and I'm the director. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Patrice Maniglier today. Maniglier is maître de conférence in philosophy at Paris-Nanterre University. He works at the intersection of various fields of research: contemporary French philosophy, philosophy of the social sciences, linguistics, anthropology, psychoanalysis, metaphysics and aesthetics, that includes film theory and contemporary art, and more recently, earth system sciences. Part of what makes Maniglier so distinguished is his defense of both a historical reinterpretation and a contemporary reactivation of structuralism or repurposing of structuralism for the present. In addition to his scholarly work, he also contributes regularly to public discussions in the media, France Entier, France Culture, Le Monde, Libération, etc. And of course, in France, the line between the academy and public engagement is a bit more blurred than it has traditionally been in the US. A former member of the editorial board of Les Temps Modernes, he has launched the journal Les Temps qui Restent. He is the author of many books, including La perspective de diable, Figuration de l'espace de philosophie de la Renaissance à Rosemary's Baby, 2010, Foucault va au cinéma, 2011, I love that title, La philosophie. Oh, really?
Yeah.
How come I'm just reading those in French? I'm practicing my to translate. La philosophie qui se fait, 2019, La Terre, le philosophe et le virus, Bruno Latour expliqué par l'actualité, 2021, pour une psychanalyse féministe, co-authored with Sylvia Lippi, 2023, La Terre ou le monde, divergence cosmopolitique, with Etienne Balibar, Maniglier, Barreau, and that's 2025. Maniglier is a visiting researcher at the CNRS, Chicago International Research Lab in the humanities and the social sciences, and happily, he will be giving several lectures on campus, including this one for 3CT. Before giving Patrice a warm welcome of applause, I'd be remiss were I not to thank 3CT staff who have worked so hard to make this event happen. Thanks to Ryan Eckel, Lucy De Silva, and the close to indefatigable. Anna Searle-Jones does not like when I say indefatigable, because she also needs to sleep. And I'd also like to thank Leticia Zucchini, who runs the CNRS Chicago Research Lab, and Professors Rachima Majumdar and Dipesh Chakrabarty, who first introduced me to Patrice's work. And now, without further ado, please thank the staff and welcome Professor Maniglier.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you, dear colleagues and friends. It's a great honor for me to present my work here in Chicago about cosmopolitanism, a work that has given, that is under this recent book with Etienne Balibar. And but before I proceed, I would like to thank not only you, actually, you are the only person that I would have thanked that you didn't thank. But I want to thank very warmly Leticia Zucchini from the IRL, the International Research Lab of the CNRS, for having me here. It required a lot of persistence and kindness, actually. So thank you very much for that, Leticia. And Anna Searle-Jones, who also didn't spare her time and effort. And Lisa, thank you again. But also I would like to mention Rachima Majumdar, who is, I think, the person who had the idea first of getting me here, and Dipesh Chakrabarty, but my debt to him will be so evident from the content of what I'm going to say that you can just take this acknowledgement as a form of teaser for what I'm going to say. Indeed, my intention here is actually to argue this. So if we agree with Dipesh on the idea that we are at a time when politics has turned planetary, which means that we are at a time when the Earth, in a notion, in a meaning that we will have to investigate further, but that the Earth has entered our political concerns in ways that alter the very concept of politics itself. If we agree with that, we also might argue that such planetarization of politics can gain a lot from the reactivation and reinterpretation of the tradition of cosmopolitanism, provided that the very idea of cosmopolitanism itself is altered to. However, I would like to add an immediate caveat to what I've just said, and in a way my entire talk is a development of these caveats. If cosmopolitanism is fit to the purpose of imagining the politics of the Earth that is so urgently needed, according to me and many others, it is not for the apparently obvious reason that comes immediately to the mind, I suppose, which would be that such a politics would require a kind of planetary government above and beyond the current divisions of the nation states in order to tackle at the right scale the challenges such as climate change, for instance, and other ones of the same kind. In fact, it is on the contrary, because cosmopolitanism is rather the idea it's the idea that political agency emerges from the impossibility, so this is a definition, from the impossibility of locking subjectivities into any one particular identity or locality, and from the irreducible heterogeneity of the political community or of the polity that are constituted as political subjectivities. So this is kind of a working definition of cosmopolitanism as a wave politics that implies that politics is always at the border, it's in between. So I'm aware that the idea of bringing cosmopolitanism in that latter sense, in relation to what I have mentioned as the planetary, might sound paradoxical to some ears here. At least that's what I would like. And indeed, the Earth seems to be our common ground, something that annuls the differences that, in another sense, matter to us a lot. And this is what Depeche indeed has argued in many of his recent works. And he called our attention to the tension there is between the global and the planetary, the global being made of differences, I will come back to that, but the planetary annulling those differences that we know are important for things, something like the Anthropocene. So the distinction between the North and the South, the rich and the poor, and the capitalist and the workers and so on, of course, matter for the production of something like the Anthropocene. They are the heart of the engine that makes the Earth come back on us in a way. But if you consider the event that they produce or that they elicit in itself, in fact, in the difference between the Holocene and the Anthropocene in geological times, if you look at the sediments, if you want, in the distant future, those differences themselves will not appear. So there is a kind of clash of scales here. And it would be a misreading, I think, of Depeche's argument to understand it as a way of disregarding those differences. It's more the idea that we cannot take responsibility for what we are actually doing, what we are actually taking part of, willingly or not, if we don't reflect on the fact that there are different scales. We are operating on different scales. So my point, in a way, will be this. I would like to argue that this permanent rescaling of our own agency, which is at the heart of the planetary, is precisely that which prevents any part of humanity or any part of the Earth from locking itself within its own territorial or cultural limits. So this is a little twist that I'm trying to make in a way. So for that reason, so the fact that we have become planetary forces prevent us from locking ourselves into our own cultural or territorial already given identities. So that reiterates in a way the cosmopolitical situation or condition. It makes diversity intrinsic to what we are in a way. So where we are here, we are also somewhere else. That's a cosmopolitical condition. So there is a kind of a irreducible internal multiplicity, which I think is very important for the tradition of cosmopolitanism. And yeah, maybe maybe I'm going to drop that idea that cosmopolitics is also a kind of politics that is able to self-relativize politics itself, because that might be a little too but I will come back if you're interested in that. Voilà. And so how am I going to make this argument? I have 4 steps, sorry, 5 steps. That's the kind of roadmap, right? So first I would like to come back on this idea that cosmopolitanism is not the dream of any kind of a universal state, but the claim that territorial belongings and political identifications are never exclusive nor univocal. That is, you cannot be yourself and none of the other, and you cannot be yourself entirely. There is something blurred or multiple in who we are, each of us. The second step will be to precisely then come back on the fact, from the idea that this kind of cosmopolitanism seems to be at odds with what we said about the planetary. And then, on closer inspection, I would like to show that the planetary condition, in fact, does reiterate the cosmopolitical condition, and more particularly, the cosmopolitical condition of the notion of cosmopolitanism as it was described in the last 2-3 decades, you might say, by some form of postmodern version of it. But with a twist. It's, in fact, cosmopolitanism in the planetary age is postmodern logic, but extended not to the cultural, but also to the physical, to the Earth, in fact. So it's the idea that the Earth itself is postmodern, not only humanity. It's not only, it's all about differences, but in fact, the Earth itself is made of differences, not only culture. That's what I'm trying to say. So what we've said about culture, now we have to say about the spatiality of the Earth itself. And that is new, that is challenging. For me, that is interesting, at least, maybe we're going to go through very difficult times, but there are interesting times. That's comforting, at least, I hope. And so the fourth step will be precisely to extend a little bit on this idea that planetary cosmopolitanism, or sometimes I call it terrestrial cosmopolitanism, claims or endorses a form of radical ontological pluralism, which say something more than there are many worlds in one world, which is already difficult to think about, but it says something like there are many Earths on Earth. And that is what I find interesting. That's what excites me. So you will have understood that I'm a philosopher, so I'm excited by paradoxical ideas. I'm a French philosopher, probably. That's why I'm not interested in trivial ideas, even though they are very interesting, I suppose. I understand the kind of Wittgensteinian twist to puzzle yourself about trivial things, but I'm more interested in puzzling myself about bizarre ideas. So I think that's one. And I will try to give just at least one example, because this will be very conceptual. But one example of what I call a cosmopolitical practice, which is the one by the Yanomami shaman David Kopenawa in his shamanic prophetic reinterpretation of global warming, which for me is a kind of epitome of what we should do. Okay, so let's start with the first step. And you can stop me when you think that I'm going too fast or saying something that really doesn't make sense, not even in an interesting way. So the cosmopolitical idea has never restricted itself, as I said, to the notion of some universal state for the entire of humanity. And that was true even since the legendary first occurrence of the word, which is attributed, as you might know, to the Cynic philosopher of the 4th century before Christ, Diogenes of Sinope, I suppose is the right pronunciation in English. So the word was used first, according to Diogenes Laertius, who was not a contemporary of Diogenes of Sinope, but much later. And so it's a word that Diogenes used in answer to the question, where are you from? So it started as a way of localizing oneself, right? And Diogenes said, I am a citizen of the world, a cosmopolitus. In fact, he should have said, I am a citizen of Sinope. But he said, no, I am a citizen of world, cosmos. So cosmos is the address, right? It's as if you were asked, what is your address? And you answer, Earth. Yeah, not Earth, cosmos, world, right? That's the idea. So it's a way of localizing himself. And it's very important because for the Greek, to be somewhere implied to have political ties, that is, obligations and rights. with regards to other people, right? So, but then, in fact, he was a foreigner, right? And so it's a way of saying that even though he was a foreigner, he claimed to have political rights or a kind of political subjectivity, not because he was from Sinope, neither because he was from Sinope, nor because Athens, which is where he was, would grant him those political rights. So you see that since the very beginning, cosmopolitanism is about political subjectivity that is not dependent on any already given particular political community. So it's not above, and it's rather like a trans-political idea, since I think the very beginning. But of course, this is very clear in Kant's, which is kind of a modern form of cosmopolitanism, and what he called the jus politicum. So there are two texts, I can't not go through that. So he refers to the idea of a set of rights that human beings have in any particular community as foreigners, not on the ground of the fact that they are citizens of another state, foreigners meaning that you are citizen of another state, right? Because that would be international rights. So cosmopolitical rights are not international rights, because they are not based on the fact that you are already a citizen. They are based on the fact that you are a human being, on the mere ground that you are a human being. And political questions could be settled only through, if political questions could be settled only through the relations between states, there would be no meaning to the notion of cosmopolitical rights, okay? So, as you can see, cosmopolitanism is not only a positive assertion, which would postulate the existence of another bigger city. It's rather a negative or critical attitude, which points at an essential overflow or excess, affecting the very principle of its constitution of political subjectivities, which, although they form somewhere, they emerge from somewhere and depend on particular attachments, they are never reducible to the network of solidarities and dependencies which conditioned them at the beginning. So they can go somewhere else. And any part of the world has to understand that it cannot restrict in advance the list of its members. There can be always someone that wasn't there before. It's open in a way. So we can move, it's open. Right, that's a cosmopolitical idea, I think, through its... but this is also true, even more so, I think, of slightly the latest phase of the reactivation of the cosmopolitical tradition, which has accompanied the extension of neoliberal globalization, in fact, giving rise to what I would call postmodern cosmopolitanism. And this is a whole series of texts and writings starting from the 1990s, 80s, to the 2010s, approximately, including works. This is my postmodern cosmopolitical gallery, people that you could add. Many friends of Tipesh. Tipesh, you're not here because you could be anywhere. So you would be too present in all my galleries that you will see. So of course these authors have a very different intellectual projects, and it would make no sense to lump them into one single doctrine. However, I think we can bring them together to highlight a contrast in a kind of comparative argument, right? So I'm emphasizing the contrastive aspect of what I'm saying. So I know I simplify that, but it's because I want to emphasize or highlight a contrast. A contrast between what? Well, in fact, between Kant's modern cosmopolitanism and this kind of more recent cosmopolitanism, which I think is very useful to enter the conceptual challenges of today's cosmopolitanism. So it's a comparative sort of attitude that I'm trying to. So what is this contrast? For modern cosmopolitanism, the ability of entities, either individuals or collectives, people like me, for instance, or maybe my entire family or my entire ethnic group, to enter or to exit various cultural and territorial collectives, and correspondingly, the impossibility for those collectives or the communities to close the list of their members in a definitive way. So those two aspects, right? The individuals can move, the communities cannot lock themselves. So for modern cosmopolitanism, this is is based on the fact that there is one univocal property that is shared by all the truths, namely humanity, in the case of Kant. In fact, you could have other properties. So it is because they are all identically human that they have the right, at least to request, to participate in social contracts, says Kant. And so this is a condition on the terms, but there is also a condition on the form of the space. For Kant, it has to be spherical. So it's a terrestrial globe. Why? Because then it is finite, homogeneous, which means that any point is equivalent to another one with regards to what humanity can do on it. And it is interconnected. That is, it means that each point can be a passage between 2 points. So there is a condition on the kind of space where cosmopolitanism makes sense. And for postmodern cosmopolitanism, it's quite different indeed, because there it's not the univocal possession or the possession of one univocal property that grounds the possibility of moving and the impossibility of closing the communities. It is rather precisely the equivocality, I'm never sure the word works, but the ambiguity, the non-identical elements of each identity. So it's the fact that I don't identify plainly to myself without in fact being somehow corrupted by someone else, something else. So I cannot identify plainly to myself. So there's some kind of ambiguity of hybridization, which is at the heart of the cosmopolitical condition. Well, that's a postmodern. So you can see there is a shift here. And there is also a shift in the form of the space there, because for Kant, it is precisely because it is a unified space, right? And here, on the contrary, it's because precisely it is fragmentary. It's precisely because there is no kind of standpoint overlooking that space from which we can unify it, that it is the right space for a cosmopolitical practice. So I made diagrams. I made diagrams to try to explain that, right? So here you have the antique. So the I that you see has to have a relation to itself, and the idea that the weight has a relation to itself implies something else. So in the case of the antique form of cosmopolitanism, it implies something like that, but we're not going to. So in the case of the modern one, so what you see here are, in fact, territories and human beings. And as you can see, they can trade, they can exchange ideas, goods, languages, and so on. But they are separate territories, but identical. So the I of each I here refers to one I for the entirety of humanity, which is in relation to the spheric Earth, which is in relation to the spheric Earth, which is a relation of property. It's a property philosophy. It's a philosophy of ownership, right? Ownership of the land, actually. This particular continent here is really based on this idea. This idea of the relation between the human and the territory is ownership. It's property. For the postmodern, here you see the I's, they are here. So each time they try to come back on themselves, they are displaced on something else, which itself tries to come back and it's displaced and so on. And the space is always in between. Okay, so that's how I'm trying to illustrate my idea here. So we have three forms of cosmopolitanism with different representatives, different form of the whole, different concept of subjectivity. So rationalized humanity, divided subject. So, wow. Now, what about now? Well, that form of cosmopolitanism, the postmodern one, seems particularly at odds with what I've just said about the introduction about planetarity. If Depeche is right, and I think he is, as I've said, the fact that we are acting, whether we like it or not, in particular if we live in metropolitan societies like ours, I think, on a scale that exceeds the spatial and temporal perception that we have of what we do, implies that, as I said, some of the differences that really matter for us and that are really at the heart of what we are doing get sort of cancelled and annulled from this other scale. So it's ironical in a way that, here is Depeche again. It's ironical that this return of totality has been sort of the consequence of the intensification of circulations, which itself has always been the condition for cosmopolitanism. So it's as if the rejection of the totality had ended up in being a production of a totality. And so it's the irony of history. And you know, some people say that cosmopolitanism is soilless, off ground. In fact, we might think it's earthless, you know, it's off the earth. It doesn't have the earth that it would need to realize its own ideals, right? It never sort of reflected on that, you can say. So it has a world, but no earth. So some people would actually disagree with Depeche on that, but I think can give at least one short argument. Greenhouse particles spread homogeneously in the atmosphere. There, the atmosphere, in a way, is one. It's because precisely it gets up to the atmosphere, and then, of course, the causes of global warming are very diverse and imply inequalities, conflicts, and so on. And the consequences are very diverse. But in the middle, there is something that is one for the entirety of the planet. So we really need to take that into account. Okay, but that, so that is, sorry, I'm reading a little fast, but go to my paper. But that's, so that means that there is no reason to, that we need to abandon the notion of cosmopolitanism to deal with this situation. And I think, no, we actually have good reasons to hold to the notion of cosmopolitanism. And for one particular reason, which is due to this that I've called encroachment. So maybe I can actually give you another diagram to explain what I mean by encroachment. Encroachment is a form of spatial overlap, which is due to the way those different partial territories are inscribed into a totality. So that is an example, or that is an illustration of the way it works. So this territory encroaches on that territory because of the way, both in a way, are taken in the cycles of regeneration of the Earth itself. So encroachment implies that two territories overlap on one another, even though they are disconnected locally, right? So you don't need to invade the Ganges Delta with arms to destroy it. You simply need to defer or to postpone the reforms of public transportation in a big metropolis like Paris or Chicago or New York, right? You don't need to go there. Because why? Because we are in the same Earth in some sense. There are at least parts of this Earth that we share. So that's what I call encroachment. And so in such a space, we cannot separate partial spatial portion from one another. So it's not like in the Westphalian vision of the world where you had separated territories with borders, which in a way regulated the tensions. Now we are actually walking into each other's feet all the time, without even moving, just by heating our room. Right? And okay, so that I think is the reason why this planetary condition somehow invites to reactivate, to reclaim the cosmopolitical tradition, even in its postmodern version. So, indeed, what do we have? Well, in a way, we have the non-identity of the truth. That is, each territory, in a way, is linked to another one. Right? It cannot identify to itself. It's not sovereign. It's not independent. It's not separated. Borders are blurred, exactly as the postmodern cosmopolitical thinkers rightly said. And that is also true of identities. So this is a postmodern identity, and this is the terrestrial identity schema in a way. But this is also true for the question of the space. As you say, as you've seen, I say that in the cosmopolitical tradition, there is something about the nature of identities, and there is something about the nature of totality. And here, there is something in the kind of totality that the planet is, which is very similar to the postmodern fragmented totality. And why? Well, precisely because what is characteristic of this spatial totality is that the sum of the parts are not integrated into one coherent whole. In fact, the whole is less than the sum of the parts. And the parts, some parts, are bigger than the whole itself. That's odd, but that I think is correct. And for instance, the calculations of the overshoots day is an example of that. In the United States, if the entire human beings lived like the residents of the United States, it would require 5.4 planets. Right? That means that one part of the planet is 5.4 bigger than the entire planet. So if you add all those parts, they don't fit in one whole, right? So you see that the space is a bit odd here. And that is really the difference with postmodern cosmopolitanism, because in postmodern cosmopolitanism, you have this idea of a kind of a entanglement of the parts and of a sort of an impossibility of having a coherent whole, except that it was precisely by renouncing the very idea of a coherent totality. But here it's on the contrary, because there is a totality in which we are, that in a way, there is more than one totality. So that is new, really. That's what I think philosophers should probably try to reflect upon. I mean, there is a new category of totality that is at work here. And at least that's what I am interested. So voila, you have here my little schemas again to try to illustrate this idea. Now, that means that the kind of plurality that we have found in postmodern cosmopolitanism is realized in the very structure of the spatiality of the Earth itself. Therefore, it's not cultural anymore. It's also physical. So like this kind of cultural heterogeneous totality is exactly what the global was. For instance, it's the idea that what we have in common is somehow produced by precisely the impossibility of making distinctions between you and me. Something like that. So we don't add up in a way. It's more the equivocity of the distinctions that make the global rather than the addition of the distinctive parts. That's what I'm trying to say. So if this is true, well, that evokes something which is another form of cosmopolitanism, a more recent one. So in the last 2 decades, at the very same time, precisely when what I call postmodern cosmopolitanism was being progressively dismissed as typically parochial expression of the globalized neoliberal elites, that's the way you can see it. At the very same time, the word cosmopolitics came back into the intellectual conversation and in the humanities and social sciences through the ontological turn in anthropology and the STS people, science and technology people. So people like Latour, for instance, Eduardo Rivero de Castro, Isabel Stengers, Anna Tsing, Donna Haraway, not here, Eduardo Rivero de Castro, and Marisol de la Cadena, and many others, have used the word cosmopolitics a lot in a strange sense, which might look strange. And of course, just like for more postmodern gallery, they have no coherent doctrine. They are very different agendas. Nonetheless, I think we can gather them together, again, by contrast, And we can say, in a way, that the main idea is this. So the main idea is that if one accepts, or the argument would be the following: if one accepts that there is something biased in the apprehension of the differences that constitutes both the material of comparison, of any kind of comparison, literature, anthropology, sociology, whatever, and of cosmopolitanism in general. So if you accept that the differences that we are concerned with, when they are described as cultural differences, this would be a biased way of looking at them. Why? For a very simple reason. There are many so-called cultures that don't function according to the culture-nature division. So if you really are interested in differences, here is the difference. Difference, which is that some people accept the nature-culture distinction, some people don't, right? So you need to take that into account if you really want to work with differences. And that, I think, is a very simple argument in favor of this going beyond the nature-culture distinction. Very simple one. It's a comparative argument, I think. And it has been too ontologized in a way. So if that is true, it means that it's not that there are many different cultures in one natural world, in that there are many different worlds. And that is, Descola recently published a book, Philippe Descola, a French anthropologist, published a book recently making this argument and suggesting that we should describe the differences as differences in world makings or world beings. Right? Okay, so it's not that there are many societies or cultures in one world, it's that there are many worlds being made. And cosmopolitics then describes what is at stake here, because politics stands for the notion of the making, world making, and cosmos obviously for world. So cosmopolitics is the way of studying how different worlds are being made. So it's different from what we've just said before. It has something in common with this notion of difference, plurality. But still, it's a little different from what we've just said. But I think, in fact, that to speak of the plurality of worlds, to understand the diversity which is at play here, is not enough. Indeed, each of those worlds go with a different earth, in fact. What I mean by that is that precisely we will speak of a Yanomami people who lives in the south of Brazil and in Venezuela. It's not simply that they distribute agency differently from, I don't know, kind of a resident of São Paulo of European descent. It's that they actually produce a different earth. So it goes beyond the difference between worlds, which can be looked at only locally. Here, it implies a different way of being inserted into the planetary situation. So I think we need to go further than this notion of plurality of worlds, and that's why we need to introduce this idea that what, for instance, anthropologists study are earths. What they study are earth makings, not world makings, or earthings, if you want. And I put there is this slogan, this motto of the Zapatistas in Mexico, un mundo donde quepan muchos mundos, a world in which many worlds fit. Well, the challenge of contemporary cosmopolitics is una tierra donde quepan muchas tierras, right? So that's a challenge. So I wanted to start exactly trying to trace what was happening to cosmopolitanism today, and I think this is what is happening to cosmopolitanism today. Well, it's both the reason why we need it and the way we need to alter it in order to make it useful for contemporary predicaments. And yeah. So this reactivation of the spirit of cosmopolitanism consists in inventing the institutions and the practices that would help situating, for instance, the modern Earth, the Earth in which we live, the one that has hit the planet, in a way, in relations to other Earths. So it's a comparative exercise. So you need to relativize the Earth of the IPCC, if you want, the Earth of Earth system sciences, the Earth of geosciences, to relativize it through the translations that are being made of it by other Earth makings. And that is what I think a cosmopolitical attitude should be doing. So paying attention to all the ways by which this very particular conception of the oneness of the Earth that goes through geosciences, but also kind of technocratic vision of the Earth, also geoengineering and that kind of things, the way they are translating within alternative versions of itself. And thus redefined as a variant in a system of variants by a set of contrastive features that locate this Earth and that locate each of them in relation to the other ones. So this way of thinking of the relation between plurality and oneness is actually structuralist. This is what I take from Lévi-Strauss. It's the concept of group of transformation. So, for instance, Lévi-Strauss claimed that the structural analysis of the Oedipus myth should take into consideration all the variants of the myth, including that of Freud, as a matter of fact, treated just flatly, just as another version, just like another version of the myth, without presupposing that one version is more like legitimate or illustrative of the myth itself, but only paying attention to the transformation that is, in fact, the differences or the correlated differences that help you understanding one version, not as a version of the prototype, but as a version of another version, right? So we don't go from the prototype and we add up feature in order to have particular variants. Variants are variants in relation to one another on one flat plane. That is a great idea that Lévi-Strauss had, I think. It's a very simple, no, it's not that simple. It's a good idea. I think it's a very good idea. And I think it works very well for what we have to do about the Earth. So the oneness of the Earth is a structural Earth. That is, it's a group of transformation of all the variants of the Earth. That's what I'm trying to suggest, and that's the kind of program that I would like to continue. So let me give you an example just to finish up, and so that we can have a conversation. So David Kopenhauer is a Yanomami shaman who wrote a book with a French anthropologist named Bruce Albert. The book has been translated it was first published in French, then translated in Portuguese and English, called The Falling Sky, Words of a Yanomami Shaman. And this book is one of the most extraordinary philosophy book of all time. So it's an impressive book. It's as good as Hegel or Leibniz. It's really very impressive in terms of sophistication of the speculative construction. But he's also a political leader and a philosopher and many other things. But in this book, then, Davi recounts how he gradually learned to translate in his shamanic prophecy what says the white called the ecology. Or rather, he understood that what he saw in his shamanic visions, some white people called it ecology, right? So he makes a kind of translation. But of particular interest for us, I think, is the moment when he understands the planetary scope of his own visions, of his own concepts. And this is, I began to understand that it was not enough to protect only the small area where we live. So I decided to speak up to defend the entire forest, including the one human beings do not inhabit, and even the white people land, very far beyond us. In our language, all this is Uriri Apre, the great forest land. I think it is what the white people call the entire world. Right? So here you see a translation of the space of coexistence of the translated versions. Right? So it's a translation of the space in which translations occur itself. And so clearly here you have two Earths. Yeah? You have the IPCC Earth, if you want, who translates the climate change discourse in a way. And so you have the Earth of the carbon cycle and the Earth forest, or the forest Earth in a way. And they are different in many ways. And of course, I cannot do justice to the complexity of visions. But I don't want to say that precisely. I don't want to say that they are saying the same thing. I just want to emphasize the diverging dimensions of them. But precisely, I think that the Earth in which we are now is made of the differences, precisely, that we can see, many other differences than the one we can see here. So, for instance, Schopenhauer has establishes a kind of a continuity between global warming and smallpox that decimates the Yanomami population. Why? Because, in fact, it is the same process for him, because it's the extractivist industries, in particular the gold miners, who take the metal off the ground, and at the same time, he says metal is a very dangerous, the white don't realize that metal is a very dangerous substance. It is normally in the ground. If you put it out of the ground, it burns everything. But at the same time, it's this very fire coming from the power of metal that produces the Shawara epidemics, that is the epidemics of smallpox. Why? Well, because precisely gold miners, if you want to, they bring the epidemic. For what we call the IPCC Earth, of course there is a distinction between global warming on the one hand and epidemics and even pandemics on the other hand. Well, now actually we're changing. Since the pandemics, we're actually thinking that it might be kind of a planetary health issue. But David wrote that in 2014, and I made that argument first in 2014, saying, well, it's interesting, this idea of the continuity and so on. He's a visionary. And as I said, though, the etiology, the cause is different. Of course, for the IPCC Earth, the cause is carbon and greenhouse gases in general. For him, it's metal. The problem is metal. And of course, again, the reason is that he's in an extractivist territory. And it might be true that extractivism undoubtedly has to do with global warming. And also, there is an interesting distinction that he makes between the surface and the depth. He says the Earth is not, well, the planet is not a volume. The Earth is a surface. It's a skin, he says. If you look at it from certain forms, at least of earth sciences or earth system sciences in particular, the Earth is rather a kind of unified volume, right? So you can see the distinctions here, a certain number of distinctions. What would be required for kind of cosmopolitical exercise that I suggest is precisely to understand the correlation between those differences. And of course, there is different which is that we access this Earth of the left through computer models, and he has access to this Earth through shamanic visions with the ayahuasca. So he sees them, whereas we estimate the Earth. He sees the Earth. Okay, there are many other examples of this kind of terrestrial cosmopolitical situations, right? Marisol de la Cadena gave one in a book called Earth Beings, but there are many others. In fact, so my point here is precisely that by making these differences, what do we do? In fact, we do not simply study different ways of looking at the Earth. We study different expression of territorial realizations of the Earth itself. So it's the Earth here in Yanomami land. That is what the Earth is. It's not the way the Earth is seen only, because there are very good reasons why it is seen like that, because it is what it is here. And so those territorial differences are not local differences, but planetary differences. That is, different ways of being situated in the entangled encroachments that are making the future of the Earth. So it's that kind of exercise that will help understanding both what the Earth is and also where one particular Earth can be situated in relation to another, but situated in a spatial sense. So the Earth is always on Earth, somewhere on Earth, but differently. Voila. And so my question was, what has become of cosmopolitanism in a planetary age? And what I try to argue with that, apart from becoming outdated, cosmopolitanism should make a step further, in a way, in what is, according to me, the most important feature of this tradition, which is the affirmation of the primacy of difference over identity, if you want, of internal multiplicity and equivocity over coherence and substantial identities. Except we need to say that this multiplicity is not only about cultures or languages and so on, but also it's about the Earth itself. So see, now we can add the last line. So the terrestrial cosmopolitanism has the form of the whole Gaia, but not Gaia in the sense of the Earth system sciences. Gaia precisely as an odd name to say that we don't know how to name it, in fact. And this is Bruno Latour who suggested that to me. And the concept of subjectivity here has to do with the notion of encroached territories. So it's where we are. We are not who we are. The who that we are is a particular location. Voila, and that's in the end what cosmopolitanism in a planetary age would imply, an Earth in which many Earths exist. Thank you very much.
We have ample time for questions, and please, you can field your own.
Yeah, thanks for this. I'm going to do something neat and ask you about a talk you didn't give, which is the opposite of this talk. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
So you started out by situating cosmopolitanism as native to the language of the globe rather than the planetary, and you invite us to imagine what's at stake in extending cosmopolitanism to the planet. I'm inspired by your talk of translation at the end, where you landed, and I wonder what would it look like to do the opposite version? That is to say, what is the native conception from the language of the planetary that one can back extend to the globe? And the most immediate thing that comes to mind, maybe as a white person, would be that of ecology itself. And indeed, if I think about ecology, it actually has a lot of the same properties that you're describing. So, for instance, the word ecology can be used to describe the ecology of the lake down the road from us. It can be used to describe the ecology of the Northern Hemisphere. It can be used to describe ecology of the planet as such. And in that way, it shuttles between these different scales quite fluidly. And I don't think that's just a quirk of language. So I can also say, and this again is an ecological thought, I am myself and my microbiome and my microbiome's imbrication in the process of industrial production and so on. In that way, I am myself and I am the world. And in that way, I also am this thing that is greater than the whole. Is there a version of a talk you could have given in which you had said, what does ecology actually do to cosmopolitanism? Or is there something that would never accomplish? Something, in other words, that you actually need cosmopolitanism to get, that ecology alone would never quite supply?
Thank you very much for this question, indeed. I guess it's a sort of embedded in what I said, that the argument is more, in fact, is more, ecology needs a form of cosmopolitanism. Even political ecology political ecology should be cosmopolitical, and not only ecological in the sense of, at least in the sense of an authoritative understanding of what ecology, or authoritarian, I should say, understanding what ecology is. Because as you said, ecology could mean many different things, in fact. For instance, you could work with the notion of the distinction between the environment as a context and the occupiers as agents, or you could, as you suggested, with the biome, the holobionte. You could, on the contrary, suggest that it implies a blurring of the internal-external distinction, and that those are very different lines. And for instance, I hinted at some point at the notion of the Earth as a surface, and I said, well, this goes against the Earth system science's concept of the Earth, but it is not exactly true, because, for instance, what is now known as the critical zone approach to the Earth precisely say that the Earth is not, the habitable Earth is not the planet itself, it's this thin skin between the internal heat coming from the kernel of the Earth and the heat coming from the sun. So there are many different concepts we could use, but that's, yeah, what I want to emphasize is that if we take seriously the planetary dimension of ecology, so if we don't understand only ecology as a local issue, but as a planetary issue, in fact, something changes here. We cannot exactly use the same concepts. In fact, that's the way I started working, I entered into this notion of cosmopolitanism. It came later. At the beginning, it was like, oh, but when you change scale, in fact, the concept changes. It's not exactly the same notion of ecology.
Hi there, thank you so much. My name is Elaine Colligan. I'm a PhD candidate in political science. I was wondering if you could clarify the register at which your talk occurs and the sense that you mean when you mobilize the word cosmopolitanism. Because at points, I thought that you were offering us a new sort of theory of political agency, right? Or the idea that a cosmopolitical vision is a kind of proscriptive idea of extending agency to the non-human. What concretely that means, I don't think that the literature has really given a very good response to. So I'd be interested in what concretely you think a cosmopolitical vision of political agency means, if that is indeed your argument. At times I thought you were referencing a theory of political subjectivity, and you mentioned, you know, the Greek Diogenes at the beginning. You kind of mentioned that political subjectivity is in some sense a claim about where one comes from or how one identifies. And I guess my question about that is that I was wondering if you could clarify if you're kind of offering a proscriptive vision of, you know, we should now identify as cosmopolitan subjects, or if it's a kind of idea, a theory of subjectivity in the more Foucauldian sense, because in some sense, you know, I can just identify as a cosmopolitan agent, no one's preventing me from doing that, but it doesn't have the kind of recursive force that the Foucauldian concept of subjectivity brings when it's actually in relationship to a real entity that forms subjects as objects of political power or subjects of political power. So, and then at other times I thought you were offering a kind of normative theory of, you know, the provisioning of rights beyond borders and beyond ecological territories. So I guess, to sum up, in what sense do you mean cosmopolitanism? Is it a theory of political agency? Is it a theory of political subjectivity? And in that sense, the Foucauldian question is at play? Or is it a kind of normative Kantian theory of migration and rights provision? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this very acute question indeed. I would answer first that I understand the kind of work I'm doing as a philosopher in a very Foucauldian way, as a form of diagnosis. So I think that when events occur, we need to diagnose what's going on. And I think the intrusion of the planetary in our lives, right? In our concerns, in our thoughts, in our practices, is such an event that requires an exercise in diagnosing what's going on. And diagnosing here, for Foucault, I think, and for me too, is trying to schematize, or maybe to dramatize differences between yesterday and today. So that's what's behind that, right? So what's happening to us? And that changes the very meaning of happen and us too, anyway. So that's probably the most important register. So it's certainly not a kind of Kantian, it's not the same kind of methodology, even though I play at that, actually. Another version of the paper is indeed, it's an argument in favor of what I call terrestrial cities and the terrestrial contract as opposed to the social contract. And my argument is then that we are, and I think it's true, we are in a situation that is quite similar to the situation in which the thinkers of the postmodernity, like Hobbes, for instance, and until Rousseau, found themselves that it's we have to move from the pre-political to the political. In a way, we are in a pre-political situation in the sense that we don't have the institutions that would make of something very important for us, for our agency. We come back to that, for our subjectivity, which is the Earth or the planet. We cannot politicize that. Yeah, we don't have the institutions, not even the aesthetics of it. That is, so now let's go back to agency. So if we decide, why not, that political thought is about agency, let's say that political theory is about agency, and that agency is not something stable, transhistorical, invariant, and so on, but it varies, and that we are in a moment where precisely agency, what it means to be an agent, is changing. So to be an agent means to be, in some sense, capable of taking responsibility for something that I'm doing. So this is actually Depeche, the way I understand Depeche's argument. So if we say, I am a planetary force, that doesn't mean that I am, let's say, a terrestrial agent or a terrestrial subject. Because for that, I would need to be able to change what I'm doing by considering the anticipated consequences of what I am doing on a planetary scale, which might imply, millions of years. And that I am not able to do very precisely, in fact. Of course, there are very easy things to mention, like flying from Paris to here, but what exactly that means, it's not very clear on a planetary scale, and there are so many other things that we don't quite know, in fact, because we don't even have the measures of that. Like when you go to the supermarkets, I don't know here, but in France, you have measures for the quality of the food in terms of health, for instance. We don't even have that for planetary. We don't know what kind of planet we are making when we do this or that, right? And let alone, having the collective institutions that would precisely help us to orient collectively infrastructures in one direction or the other. We don't have that. So I think we are in a pre-political situation here. And but when I say that, it's not really prescriptive or normative. It's more like it's more a way of saying, okay, if you want to take the notion of freedom seriously, how can you do that if you don't take responsibility for what you are actually doing? If you don't want to do that, no problem for me. But if you want to do that, then here you have a problem. So it's not, I don't have a meta-political agenda. Well, I'm very allergic to that kind of attitude, but that's me, I suppose. So, so I don't know if it answers to all of your questions, but I guess it does, at least to some aspect of it. So it's a diagnosis on what is happening to us. And I can play at saying that there is a kind of prescriptive, but this play is more a way of making us more aware that something is happening, and can we be up to what is happening to us? That is the only prescriptive ethics that I would have, to be up to the event. This is not me, so Gilles Deleuze. It's Deleuze who would say that. And I think it's very powerful. The best ethical stance is to be up to the event, and we are not up to this event. And when we are not up to such an event, it has consequences, because the event is here and it's working through in unfortunate ways. Symptoms, basically. Yeah. So it's a clinical, in a way it's a clinical. I guess the register is clinical. Nietzsche said that a philosopher is a clinician. I'm a clinician. Yeah.
Actually, it follows from Ilian's question in some ways, and I thank you very much for the talk. And I thought what you said initially in response to her was very insightful, that the event takes us back to the pre-political condition. In other words, there was a pre-political situation, let's say in the 17th century, out of which modern politics emerges. And we are now back in a pre-political condition in the sense that we have not been able to work out the politics to come, the politics you need to be adequate to this event. And I think that's for me, it's a very insightful statement. I was going back to your schema, and I'm very fascinated by what you have to say about a totality, this re-emergence of a totality, which is also not a totality. Right? And then you introduce the shaman in the story to eventually talk about these two schemas of cosmopolitanism. And I want to draw your attention to two kinds of differentiation. So if you think of the Earth system science, and I think they sometimes overclaim the unity of the totality by using it in the singular. They could have used it in the plural. But here's my point. The point is, however you define the planet, including the deep oceans and the ozone layer, things we don't experience, even before there were any humans, that planet would have manifested itself differently for different animals in different parts of the world, right? Human absent. So what you have is a human absent but human observed totality, right? It is both differentiated, but its properties are kind of human observed. We use our instruments to find out that this is something we're affecting, but it was there before us, both as one and not one. So I'm calling it a human absent difference, but a human observed difference.
Okay.
But when you bring the shaman in, you're actually bringing in an anthropological difference between human beings, right? Because your own sentence that there are some people who don't make the nature culture distinction. So critically, you need those people who don't make that distinction. That's what I mean by anthropological difference. So you've introduced an anthropological difference. And then my question is, how do I think about these two different kinds of totalities? One is a totality that is, there are many Earths, but it is difficult for humans to have many Earths that actually go beyond human experience. That's why what the sciences, the technologies bring to us is a human observed but human absent difference, right? I mean, so in a way, Miyasu's point about ancestrality is about that which I am reporting to you in the language of science, but which would have been here as one and not one, even if I were not here.
Yeah.
So, and it's that phenomenon of one and not one that we are trying to meet through the phenomenon of the one and not one of human experience. And I was just wondering about what problems this distinction that I'm making would pose for your thinking.
Thank you, Dipesh. And I'm not sure I would describe precisely those differences, our anthropological differences. Ultimately, that is, of course, you enter into that distinction as an anthropological distinction, but I mean, anything between what Schopenhauer says and what Earth system scientists say, that seems to be an anthropological difference between what two human beings say, or two human groups say.
Two ways of being, two ways of life.
Exactly. But if you follow, if you enter with by conceiving it as a human difference or difference between human beings, one with a human and non-human, the human observed but human absent,
Yeah.
and the other one, well, maybe
Human present, human observed. Yeah,
human present and human observed.
yeah. It's
Mm.
or at least human present.
But when you at least when you follow the line of the description, only of the description, the study anthropological in the sense of the discipline of anthropology, again, what you observe precisely is that the distinction between the human and the non-human, as well as the distinction within humanity, changes. And so I don't think it would be. So I could say, well, it is the distinction between the human and the non-human that is not preserved. But this is not exactly true in Copenhagen. And for Copenhagen, it is not. I think it wouldn't be correct to say that for him it's a human observed and human present. Well, because the human is not always present, and of course, and then you can say, yeah, but that's what he says.
That's what he said.
Sure.
It brings in the emimetic distinction.
Yeah, it's like Escher's hand that draw one another, I think. We are in a situation where one hand draw another hand.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
the movie is
exactly, we kind of move you straight. So you pass from one to the other and then you go back. And that's, and probably we need to work with that, in fact, and not trying to hierarchize the two points of view, the global or the planetary. In fact, we move from one to the other permanently through that kind of line of reasoning. And so, yes, I think from his point of view, which is not a point of view for him, hey, yeah, well, it's not a point of view. And it's, he's looking at a world in which the human is very contingent, is very fragile, it's very unlikely. You know that Lévi-Strauss once was asked, could you give us a definition of the myth? And he said, well, I cannot give you a definition of the myth because it's against my methodology, but I can tell you what the people from the indigenous people from the Americas would say. It's the stories of the time humans and animals were not distinguished. Okay, so you could say that there is a human. Well, not exactly. And so that's one thing. And the other thing I would like to say that, yes, okay, I could accept this description of, let's say, the scientific Earth as an Earth in which there is this distinction between human observed and human absent. But it still needs to be located on Earth. By which I mean that in order to make the human absent, you actually need a lot of Earth resources. You need satellites, you need computers, big computers, and so on. And that encroaches on the other one. So they have their word, in a way, to say.
That's right.
Yeah. But that's, so how do we localize it? This is Latour's really, it is one way of continuing Latour's argument, that localizing the global on the Earth, that is localizing this Earth that is described on Earth itself. So again, that's a Moebius strip. So yeah, I think we cannot really, or we need to understand where exactly the distinction you're making between the human and the non-human, or the human observed and the human absent, is made. Where is it made? And to relativize it, not in the sense of undermining its legitimacy, but in the sense of recharacterizing what it is doing on Earth, where on Earth it is. Where on Earth is the Earth system. But again, as you said, and that was also implicit in what you said, that there are many concepts of the Earth in Earth sciences themselves. And one thing that I'm also impressed by is the fact that if you look at the IPCC reports, the models that they use very poor social parameters. Like, for instance, open societies, closed societies, rather poor for people in political sciences, anthropology, and so on. So it's a bit gross. But in order to understand what are the differential parameters that are at work in the future of the Earth. Well, what I'm doing, in a way, is also a way of saying, well, if you bring a comparative approach into that, you can maybe also identify some parameters which you don't see when you have a kind of a one-sided point of view of what the anthropological is. So yeah, my hope is that one day, who knows, we can bring together the humanities and the social sciences and the climate sciences. But as you know, this is almost impossible to do because, yeah, it's a real culture divide.
Hey, Patrice, thank you for the talk. I'm David. I translated your Saussure article a long time ago. It feels like. Yeah. I have a question about contemporary French philosophy and epistemology and how it relates to what you spoke about. I guess I would put it like this. I'm curious what epistemological sort of framework fits with your vision if we look at what's come out of contemporary French thought. I'll be very crude here. On the one hand, you have Meillassoux, so a sort of extreme scientific realism. And then on the other hand, someone like a Bruno Latour, so a kind of relativizing, socially inflected sort of discourse. Which, if either of those sort of is the vision that fits with what you're speaking about? Is it that we need to sort of cede ground to a kind of Meillassoux, like there's a kind of absolute scientific, the mathematical sciences have a sort of absolute claim to knowledge about how things are, or is it that we need to go in the Latour direction or something that's neither of those?
Thank you very much. You know, the good thing when you are a comparative structuralist like me, is that you don't need to say someone is right or someone is wrong. You can use the differences in order to redefine each other and all of them. And so, of course, I could say, probably if I was honest, I would say, no, I'm on the Latour side. But I'm not honest, in fact. It's not only that, I think there is more to it. I think my argument tends to precisely relocate or situate, in the sense of situated epistemologies rather, first Meillassoux talk as a variant of something in which this radical distinction between, let's say, reality and representation is not made. So I'm not saying that one is true and the other one is false. I'm saying that they need to be understood in relation to one another as different variants of one another. And the question is, what are the hidden parameters of variation? And that's what the structural analysis will bring about, in a way. So, and that was a conversation I had a lot with Latour, because I didn't convince him. But I tried to argue, precisely on the speculative realist movement and that kind of things, I tried to argue that we Latourians, if I might say, we had to make some room for absolutism. We, the relativists, we actually have no problem with people being absolutist. They're just one position, not in the sense that everything goes, but in the sense that we can learn what it takes to be an absolutist by difference with a relativist. What are the correlated differences that underpin, in a way, the structure of this variation, which is our situation. And so Latour had this concept of double click in his big book, The Inquiry of Mode of Existence. This double click here is the name of what is wrong, but you don't have the right to say that anything is wrong. So it's the name of the absolute, in fact. That is a positive thing. It's a mode of existence in itself. And so that's what's a kind of argument. But as far as this Meillassoux attitude is concerned, for instance, if you think of this notion of the indifferent real, how can't we feel that there is something clearly affective in the sense of sentimental, right? It's the mountain turns its back to me and I have to climb it, but it doesn't look at me. Well, Someone who doesn't look at you is someone, right? Someone who neglects you is someone.
Yes.
That's the planet. The planet neglects you, right? The planet treats you badly in the sense of not intentionally, but precisely because it is completely indifferent. To be indifferent is an affective position, right? It's a relation. So I think Miyasu was clearly a poet. It's good, it's very good. But we don't need to, well, and for this poetry, we need to think of it as not being poetry. True, okay, good. Good. Let's work with that, but let's work in order to enrich, in a way, the understanding of who we are in relation to that. And this, in fact, is what I took from Stengers even more than Latour, in fact, because Stengers had this very beautiful way of, I think, explaining what philosophy was for her, which was not critique, but she says it doesn't matter to think if it's not to enrich our perception of ourselves. And I think that's, yeah, I think I agree with that. Yeah. It's, it has to enrich the perception of where we are, who we are, what's going on now, and so on. Not to make it poorer. And probably that has to go with that probably goes with the Anthropocene. Yeah. In the time of the Planetary, we don't have the luxury of critique. We need to enrich. Everybody can be useful for us to enrich ourselves, even the worst people.
We have time for one more question, if there is one. All right, then. Well, thank you very much.